There's a side of you you've been avoiding, not because it's evil, but because it's wounded. That side holds the pain, shame, anger, and fear you've been told to bury, suppress, or ignore. This is your shadow, and no matter how hard you try to pretend it doesn't exist, it still shapes your choices, your relationships, and the way you see yourself. Shadow work isn't about fighting the darkness. It's about meeting it with honesty, compassion, and courage. It's the path of true healing, where you stop running and start listening. When you explore your inner darkness, you don't become broken, you become whole. This journey isn't comfortable, but it's necessary, because until you make peace with your shadow, you'll always be at war with yourself. If you're ready to stop hiding and start healing, this is where the real work begins. The shadow is not a monster hiding beneath your bed. It's not some evil force waiting to ruin your life. It is you. It's the forgotten, denied, and rejected parts of yourself, your insecurities, your hidden fears, your desires that make you uncomfortable, and your emotions you were taught not to feel. The shadow is the emotional baggage you carry when you pretend to be fine, the voice you silence when you want to scream, and the truth you bury under the mask you wear for the world. When you don't acknowledge these parts, they don't disappear, they just get louder in silence. They become the invisible hand that guides your behavior, often in destructive ways. You may wonder why you attract toxic relationships, why you sabotage your success, or why you lash out in anger over small things. It's often not the moment that causes the reaction, it's the years of suppressed wounds that the moment triggers. From childhood, we're taught what's acceptable and what's not. Don't cry, don't be angry, don't be selfish, don't be too sensitive. Slowly you begin to divide yourself. The parts that get love and approval are embraced while the others are pushed into the shadow. But those parts still want attention. They don't go away. Instead, they leak out through jealousy, resentment, impulsive actions, addictions, and anxiety. What you don't face, you repeat. What you ignore, you project. What you repress, you become. If you don't meet your shadow, it will meet you in your relationships, your failures, and your emotional breakdowns. The shadow is not here to hurt you. It's here to wake you up. The irony is that the more you try to avoid your shadow, the more power it has over you. You may think you're in control, but your shadow is pulling the strings. It influences your beliefs, your self-worth, and how you respond to life. That self-critical voice in your head, that's the shadow reminding you of every failure and shortcoming. That fear of being abandoned, that's your unhealed inner child begging to be seen. The anger you explode with when someone disrespects you, that's your shadow screaming the truth you refuse to speak. Every time you ignore it, its grip on you tightens. Understanding the shadow is the beginning of taking back your power. It means you stop pretending and start listening. You begin to ask, why did I react that way? Instead of blaming others, you start to see your pain not as a problem, but as a message. Every trigger becomes a teacher. Every discomfort becomes a doorway. Shadow work invites you to explore your inner world, not to shame yourself, but to reclaim the parts of you that were lost. You begin to realize that you're not broken, you're divided, and healing is the process of becoming whole again. You don't need to be a therapist or a spiritual master to start this work. You just need the willingness to be honest with yourself, to admit when you're pretending, to be curious about your patterns, to journal your thoughts instead of suppressing them, to sit in silence and feel what you've avoided for years. It might be uncomfortable, it might be painful, but it will also be freeing, because when you meet your shadow, you begin to understand yourself in ways you never have before. Most people try to heal by only focusing on the light, the positivity, the affirmations, the motivation, but without facing the shadow, all of that becomes a mask. True strength is not in how positive you can be, it's in how deeply you're willing to sit with your pain without running from it. It's in how bravely you can face the parts of yourself you once judged. When you begin to integrate your shadow, you don't become darker, you become deeper. You begin to love yourself not just for your light but for your flaws, your wounds, your humanity. This work is not about fixing yourself, it's about meeting yourself. It's about looking at your reflection with all its cracks and learning to say, even this part is worthy of love. Because the moment you accept your shadow, it stops controlling you. You stop reacting out of fear and start responding with awareness. You stop blaming the world and start understanding yourself, and in that understanding you find freedom. You were never meant to live in fragments. You were never meant to pretend to be someone you're not. The shadow is your invitation to come home, to the wholeness, the authenticity, and the depth that only truth can give you. It's not easy, but it's worth it, because the moment you stop running from your shadow is the moment you start reclaiming your life, and that is where real healing begins. Work is learning how to identify and recognize your triggers. Triggers are emotional reactions that seem to come out of nowhere, an overreaction to something small, a sudden burst of anger, sadness, jealousy, or fear. Most people think these reactions are caused by the present moment, but in truth, they're echoes from the past. They are not about what just happened, they're about wounds you haven't healed. A trigger is the shadow knocking on the door, asking to be seen. It is not your enemy, it's your guide, but if you ignore it, it controls you. If you listen to it, it frees you. Recognizing your triggers is not always easy. Often we live in autopilot, Repeating the same reactions, using the same excuses, defending the same behaviors. That's just how I am. They made me angry. I can't help it. These are all ways of protecting the wounded self, but when you start to do shadow work, you begin to question those reactions. You pause and ask, why did that bother me so much? What does this remind me of? Where did I learn to react like this? These questions open a door to parts of your psyche that have long been hidden, and once that door is open, you begin to reclaim your power. Every trigger tells a story. If a friend ignoring your message fills you with rage, maybe your inner child is remembering what it felt like to be emotionally neglected. If you feel instant jealousy when someone is praised, perhaps there's a part of you that still believes you're not good enough. If you always feel attacked by criticism, maybe deep down you carry shame that you've never spoken about. These emotions are not random. They are clues, breadcrumbs leading you back to the root of your suffering. Shadow work requires radical honesty. It asks you to look beyond the surface and into the depths. Not to blame yourself, but to understand yourself. Instead of labeling your reactions as bad or crazy, you start to see them as messengers. Each time you're triggered is a chance to explore an unresolved wound. And when you take that chance, you begin to shift. You don't just manage emotions, you heal them. You don't just suppress pain, you transform it. This practice also cultivates emotional maturity. Instead of projecting your pain onto others, you take responsibility for it. You stop making the world responsible for your healing. You realize no one can save you from your inner world but you. And that realization is both terrifying and liberating. Because once you know your reactions are yours to own, you're no longer a victim of your past. You're the architect of your healing. The goal is not to stop being triggered. The goal is to become conscious of your reactions and learn from them. Every moment of discomfort becomes an opportunity to evolve. You grow not by avoiding pain but by facing it with awareness. And that awareness slowly rewires your entire way of being. You start choosing responses over reactions. You create space between stimulus and response. That space is where growth lives. That space is where your power returns. When you learn to observe your triggers without judgment, you begin to see yourself clearly for the first time. And in that clarity you stop seeing your wounds as weaknesses. You see them as sources of wisdom. You begin to honor your journey, not in spite of the pain but because of it. You realize that every reaction you've ever had was trying to protect a younger version of you. And now, with love and patience, you begin to show that version of you a different way. Focuses on the emotional resistance that arises when confronting our shadow. This resistance is subtle yet deeply embedded in our psyche. It doesn't always show up as fear or anger. Sometimes it appears as boredom, distraction, procrastination, or the urgent need to fix something outside of us. These are defense mechanisms created by the ego to protect the fragile parts of ourselves we have denied or buried. When we approach shadow work, our unconscious mind feels threatened because this work threatens the very identity we've carefully crafted. This resistance is natural. It is a psychological immune response designed to keep us safe, but ironically, it keeps us imprisoned. Many people mistake this discomfort as a sign they're doing something wrong. In truth, it's often a sign that they're getting closer to something real. Shadow work is not about diving into darkness blindly. It's about sitting with the discomfort and observing what it's trying to say. When we avoid this resistance, we continue to stay stuck in old patterns, haunted by emotional triggers and self-sabotaging behaviors. But when we turn toward it with curiosity, we create space for transformation. At this stage, people often feel confused. The mind begins to question, why am I feeling this way? Why am I remembering this painful moment from childhood? Why do I feel like crying for no reason? These are invitations, not intrusions. They are the beginning of integration. The emotional resistance is not something to forcefully overcome, but rather something to gently hold. If the inner child starts to cry, it is not weakness, it is release. The moment we allow our buried feelings to surface without judgment or shame is the moment healing truly begins. Emotional resistance loses power when it is understood, not when it is fought. Our emotional body is not our enemy. It's a compass pointing us to where we've abandoned ourselves. In the process of shadow work, this resistance can come in waves. Some days you'll feel powerful insights. Other days you might feel nothing at all. That's part of the journey. Healing is not linear, and the ego prefers predictability. But real transformation requires that we sit in the unknown, the messy middle, the in-between of who we were and who we are becoming. The resistance wants you to numb out. It wants you to go back to your distractions, to scroll endlessly, to blame others, to work overtime so you don't have to feel. But the soul invites you to stay, to breathe, to feel fully. That choice, to stay present in the discomfort, is the gateway to liberation. This kind of inner work requires tremendous courage. It's not dramatic or loud. Often it's quiet and invisible. No one sees you choosing to feel that panic instead of suppressing it. No one claps for you when you breathe through your sadness instead of shutting it down. But this unseen work rewires your nervous system. It creates new emotional pathways. It allows you to meet life with greater presence and compassion. When emotional resistance arises, it is not a sign you're failing. It is a signal that something important is ready to be met. And when you meet it, not with judgment but with presence, it begins to soften. Emotional resistance often reveals the very wound we need to address. If a certain memory keeps coming back, that's not random. If you always react the same way in specific situations, that's not a coincidence, it's a map. And emotional resistance is the first marker on that map. Instead of seeing it as a wall, begin to see it as a doorway. Behind it is the part of you that wants to be seen, held, and loved. But first it tests you. It asks, will you stay? Will you numb me again? Or will you finally listen? Most people run at this point, but those who stay begin to hear the quiet truth their soul has been whispering all along. This work can't be rushed. The ego wants fast healing, instant clarity. But the soul speaks in a different rhythm, slower, deeper, truer. When you feel resistance, ask yourself, what is this feeling trying to protect? What would happen if I allowed it to speak? Not every answer will come in words. Some will come in sensations, images, or tears. The key is not to interpret everything, but to allow it. The more you allow, the more the shadow begins to integrate. And what once felt terrifying becomes tender. What once felt chaotic begins to feel sacred. In truth, emotional resistance is part of your awakening. It means you are touching something real, something vital. And every time you meet it with compassion instead of control, with presence instead of avoidance, you reclaim another part of yourself. Shadow work is not just about seeing the dark. It's about loving the parts of yourself that were once unloved, especially by you. When emotional resistance rises, it's not an obstacle, it's the moment your transformation begins. Many people suppress their emotions and painful memories in an attempt to be strong or maintain control, but the real power lies in facing those buried shadows. To integrate the shadow is not to fix it or remove it, but to become aware of its influence and bring it into conscious awareness. The parts of ourselves we reject, rage, jealousy, shame, fear, don't disappear when ignored, they fester in the dark and show up as self-sabotage, emotional numbness, or projections onto others. When we deny these aspects of our personality, they gain more power over our behavior. The journey of shadow work involves deliberately turning inward and asking ourselves difficult questions, especially when we're triggered, defensive, or overly critical. These reactions often point to unacknowledged wounds or fears that were never given a voice. Instead of seeing our reactions as weaknesses or flaws, we must begin to view them as messengers from the unconscious, trying to teach us something essential. As we begin to name these parts, like the part of us that feels worthless, or the one that fears abandonment, we reclaim our power from them. We stop letting these unconscious patterns control our relationships, our self-worth, and our choices. Shadow work allows us to trace the root of our emotional pain, rather than simply reacting to its symptoms. For instance, a person who constantly seeks validation may discover that, deep down, they never felt seen or accepted as a child. The need for external approval is merely a coping mechanism to cover the deeper wound of invisibility. Once that origin point is found and felt fully, healing begins, not because the pain disappears, but because it is finally acknowledged and held with compassion. This process is not about blaming parents, society, or anyone else. It's about taking responsibility for the emotional legacy we carry, and choosing not to pass it on. The shadow, once illuminated, becomes our greatest teacher. It shows us where we are fragmented, where we've abandoned ourselves, and where we need love the most. When we give presence to those inner voices we've silenced for years, we no longer feel split or ashamed. We begin to see that darkness is not something to fear but something to integrate, to hold with tenderness. In doing so, we stop acting from the unconscious pain, and begin to act from awareness. Shadow work transforms not by giving us new information but by shifting the relationship we have with ourselves. Instead of fighting our inner demons, we sit with them, understand them, and eventually befriend them. This doesn't mean we justify harmful behavior, but we understand its origins, so we can respond rather than react. Emotional mastery doesn't come from controlling feelings, it comes from allowing